Okay, well, hello everyone, good evening. I'm Alan Miller. I'm one of the directors of the New York Salon, alongside Jean Smith, who's in the audience, co-director. I'd like to welcome you this evening to the New School, who we have an ongoing partnership for a series about what it means to be human, of which this is the second one, part of the International Battle of Ideas Satellite Festivals actually as well, so a combination of partnerships. Just briefly, obviously the title tonight is Can We Still Have Faith in the Academy? But just to talk about our relationship with the Battle of Ideas Satellite Festivals, it is now in its third year. It grew out of the Battle of Ideas Festival, which is now in its eighth year in Britain, in London, which has annually over 350 speakers and several thousand attendees over a weekend, discussing a range of issues on everything from people singing in a choir, to bioethics, to can we have equality, to the question of humanity. So it deals with a whole range of issues and subjects. Out of that was developed 3 years ago the Satellite Festival, which aims to inculcate and take internationally some of the ideas of the discussion and the debates across a number of countries across Europe and India and in New York too. So I'm going to get to the speakers fairly quickly because we have a limited time tonight. Obviously, Hurricane Sandy is still with us to a certain extent in New York and New Jersey for many people, and some of the students are actually going to be here this evening. So we have to finish promptly at 8:30 and then really be out by 9 so everyone can get everything taken down. So I'm not going to say too many things from here, and I'm going to get to the great panel that we've got this evening. Obviously, the discussion around education, both in the recent presidential election and more generally in society, is one that people have very emotive ideas about and is very important. In this discussion about whether we can have faith in the academy, we've posed this question to the panelists. It's actually been 25 years since Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind came out. And there's a quote from that where he says that higher education has failed democracy and impoverished the souls of today's students. Now, people will have a view about whether that was right then or whether that's even right now. And that's one of the things that sort of, I think, is poignant way to kick off to then get into the panelists. So I'm going to introduce the panelists in the order that they're going to be speaking tonight. Immediately next to me is Anya Kamenetz. Anya's a senior writer at Fast Company magazine. She's also the author of 4 books on education. One is on generation debt. One is DIYU, Edupunks, Edupreneurs, and the coming transformation of higher education. I strongly recommend it. It's an excellent read. As well as 2 ebooks, the Edupunks Guide and Learning and Freedom and the Web. And she's also been named a game changer in education by the Huffington Post, as well as many other commendations. And I really recommend you go to our website to see the full bio of the speakers because they're very impressive. Then next to me is Professor Andrew Delbanco, who is the Mendelssohn Family Chair of American Studies and the Julian Clarence Levi Professor in the Humanities at Columbia University. He was awarded the 2011 National Humanities Medal by President Barack Obama for his writing that spans the literature of Melville and Emerson to contemporary issues in higher education. He was also named by Time magazine as America's Best Social Critic. He's the author of many books, including most recently College, What It Was, Is and Should Be, also an excellent read, strongly recommend it. Then I have Professor David Scobey, directly next to Andrew. He became the Executive Dean of what is now the New School for Public Engagement in 2010. He's a national leader in developing innovative methods to engage institutions of higher education with communities outside of the academy. David is also the author of Empire City, The Making and Meaning of New York City Landscape, and taught for 16 years at the University of Michigan, primarily as Professor of Architecture. And finally, on my far right is Angus Kennedy, who's the head of external relations for the Institute of Ideas, the organisation that actually organises the Battle of Ideas Festival in London, as well as one of the organisers and initiators of the international satellite events. He writes for a number of publications on a range of interests, particularly classics, the Holocaust, culture and the arts. He's also the convener of the Institutes of Ideas' new initiative, which is the Academy, which very much takes the spirit of the liberal arts and humanities colleges. So, without further ado, I'm going to ask the panelists to give us their answer about whether we can still have faith in the academy. But just to give you a little format for the evening, the panelists are going to speak for a short period of time, after which there'll be a little back and forth between us, and then I'm going to go straight over to you guys. So you'll get plenty of time to engage and chat and ask questions and also put your ideas forward. As long as we keep the format fairly tight, and I will moderate quite tightly. So that's how we're going to run it. So over to you, Anya.
Great. Thanks, Alan, for the introduction and the invitation. I'm always very often very abashed and surprised to find myself on the panels with people that I'm on. So that definitely holds true tonight. The question is, do we have faith in the academy? And the quote is about the university education impoverishing the human soul. And the unfortunate thing is that university education today has a chance of impoverishing the human's body as well. So we have a situation where the university, as it has become, what it has become today, is something that is unsustainable in a dimension that it never dreamed of, because it never thought of itself as having to sustain itself financially or economically, or as a financial or economic enterprise. And yet it's in this strange situation where the tuition that's being charged to students to take part in this incredible ritual, incredible privilege, is growing at the rate of 5% a year. That's twice the rate of inflation, and it's kept up that pace for 30 years or more. And if you look at the graph of college tuition, you'll see that it outpaces the cost of actually any other good or service that's tracked by the Consumer Price Index. It's higher than the rate of medical care. And if you look at that graph as a curve, it's one of those famous hockey stick curves, which for people who, I used to give presentations where I compared the curve of college tuition to the curve of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. It's related to a classic curve, which was a classic state of ecological overshoot, where deer were introduced into an island where they had no natural predators, and the population of the deer started to grow, and then it grew and grew and grew and grew and grew, and everyone knows what happens eventually to that, right? So I've been posited sometimes as a straw woman, as an enemy of the academy, but I don't come to bury it. I really feel that all I'm kind of trying to do is point out that a house on fire is on fire. And that what people who love what the academy has stood for in its best moments are really incumbent upon them to sort of go into the museum and take out what's most valuable and take it and move it to a new safe place. And I think in this case of the academy, what we're talking about is learning for its own sake, the love of the life of the mind, the inquiry of what the good life is, the fellowship that comes between people when they are not taking place in commerce and they're not participating in in a particular faith tradition, which also, our religions preserve similar types of spaces, but it's only in the academy that a space for time away from the marketplace is also dedicated not to a faith, a particular faith, but it's dedicated to the very spirit of free inquiry, which allows us to make new discoveries. So we need research, we need learning, we need fellowship, but we don't necessarily need all of the trappings of the function, that are associated with the function university, or as Clark Kerr said it best, pointing this issue out, many decades ago. He talked about the multiversity, right? And I think that the idea that he was pointing out is only now coming to fruition, and we really see the birds coming home to roost, in the sense that when an institution tries to be all things to all people, it's going to fail at many, many, many of them. And the university, I think we could say, at this point in time, has been a victim of its own success. And very much so for the efforts taken by, the very esteemed academicians and students, people of my father's age who were students in the 1960s and 1970s. He was a Yale class of 1970. He was part of the group that was organizing on behalf of Bobby Seale, the Black Panther, which disrupted final exams in the class of 1970. And this was really a time when people saw the university as being the field on which we were going to have the fight about civil rights and about democracy and what kind of country we really wanted. And people were looking not only to the professors but to the students to decide it. And it was an incredible moment of opportunity. But the repercussions of that moment were twofold. One was that when people of all kinds demanded a place in the university, and they demanded it on the basis of merit alone and not just on race or gender or where they were born, this was a very just claim, right? So when Kingman Brewster said, we're not going to have quotas for Jews in a Yale undergraduate class, but we're going to take the SATs and people are going to get in based on their SAT scores, and we're going to be need blind in admissions, and we're going to pay for people to go to the school regardless of their ability to pay themselves. They made a really big promise. They wrote a really big check there, and a lot of private universities tried to follow on that, and then spreading from there onward in the 1960s and 1970s, everybody wanted in the door of higher education. Higher education is the kind of thing that people want. If they can take advantage of it, they want to have access to it. And when you start opening the doors to everyone, it's a much bigger enterprise. It's a much more expensive enterprise. The people that are going to be in the door need a lot more help in order to succeed in that enterprise. You know, for people that are enrolling in university today, half of those who come into a community college, which is half of all freshmen, so a quarter of people who come into college today need a high school level course in order to begin to take college level courses. So they're going into remedial courses, they're paying college tuition to take remedial courses. This is very expensive. To accommodate people, paying financial aid, to accommodate people who need, Title IX accommodations in sports, people with various kinds of disabilities, all of this is extremely expensive. And that's completely leaving aside the way the academy has evolved in the offerings of what we're studying, so that it's no longer about the classics or the 7 liberal arts, but it's about every kind of study, every kind of literature, every kind of representation, hundreds of languages. There's literally no end to it. And so I think what we're kind of coming to recognize as a society is that enterprise is not going to be able to continue to grow by expanding and taking up every single thing in its path the way it tried to do and succeeded in doing for most of the 20th century. We're going to have to completely reimagine it and remake it from the ground up. And the question of how to do that, I hope, will be the topic of the rest of this conversation or future ones.
Thanks, Anya. Andrew.
Okay, I'll try to behave and be brief. I make a living such as it is by looking at words, so I thought I would look at the title of our panel. Can we still have faith? And the two words that jump out at me are still and faith. And Anya, I think, has done a very good job of addressing the still part of that question. That is, what are we at a break point, a critical moment where our assumptions about how the system has worked, its sustainability, may no longer be reasonable? Can it continue to be affordable, available, attainable, all the things that have been part of the dream of sort of universal higher education in the United States? And I think those are very good questions, and they're very good reasons to be worried about it. I want to inject into the conversation just a note that I think one of the things we can be proudest of in our country is the largely successful effort we made to provide a post-secondary education opportunity for more people as a proportion of the population than any country in history. And you can watch that process beginning really with church-sponsored scholarships in the colonial period, the passage of the Morrill Act, which the Congress somehow found time and attention to do in the middle of the Civil War, that created the land-grant colleges that became the great state universities, the GI Bill following the Second World War, the creation of the California system that Anya alluded to, which virtually guaranteed higher education to everyone with a high school diploma, from the community colleges through the state colleges up to the great research universities. As a literary type, I like to frame this story between two quotations, one from the writer to whom I always turn, Herman Melville, who, as you may remember, when Ishmael comes somewhat warily to the Pequod and thinking about signing up, and he's heard these rumors about this very peculiar, eccentric captain that he will be working for, the owner of the ship says to him, "Ahab has been in colleges as well as among the cannibals," which is a pretty efficient way of saying this is a very weird guy, because in the middle of the 19th century, very few people went to college. If you flash forward 100 years, you come to Arthur Miller's great play, All My Sons, produced in the year of the GI Bill, in which a member of the older generation complains, looks around and says, "Today you stand on the street corner and spit, and you hit a college man." So what Anya is saying is that we should be worried. I don't mean to put words in her mouth. She's well capable of speaking for herself. But I think what she's saying is that we should be worried that this story really is over. And there are good reasons to be worried about it. But I think we might want to push a little on the detail. You used the singular term, college or university, quite often. We want to remember that we have, one of the glories of the American system is that we have lots of different kinds of institutions. So the fact is that tuition has actually been going up most rapidly in the public institutions, and that is attributable to a huge public disinvestment in the system that I was just describing. In private institutions, although the sticker price has been going up very dramatically over the last quarter century, the actual net tuition dollars that are coming into those institutions has been growing much more slowly, which tells you that the private institutions have still done a pretty impressive job of making opportunity available to students who can't pay full freight. A large part of the student loan burden that we hear so much about has actually been created by the for-profit institutions, which are almost entirely online and who sort of made a promise that by bringing market principles and efficiencies to bear on the business of education, they would be able to solve this problem. And I don't think so far the returns on that are very good. So I think we do need to imagine a new future. Two quick points about that, and then I'll shut up. To go to that other word in the title, faith. Why should we be worried about this? That is, what's at stake? What did we once have faith in? In what has our faith been shaken? Well, it's been shaken in the ability of higher education to prepare citizens for the marketplace, which is basically the only thing you hear in public discourse about the importance of higher education. You hear it from both parties, that is, the economic value of higher education. The other thing that our faith, I think, has been shaken in is the capacity of our institutions of higher education to prepare citizens. That is, to prepare the educated citizenry that we need to sustain a democracy. And we could talk about that some. And the third thing that I think is important not to forget is that America has been quite unique in its commitment to the idea that young people should have an opportunity between adolescence and adulthood, the boundaries of which are always moving, to reflect and pause and contemplate and engage in an act of self-discovery to find out who they are. The American college has been quite an effective institution in doing that. So I think those are the three missions that are at stake, and I agree that we need to rethink the shape of the institutions that may or may not deliver them. The implication in many of these conversations is that technology will be the answer, that we will move, as it were, these functions into a space that will be more accessible and more affordable, and I'm sure we will talk about that for the rest of the evening. Thanks.
Thank you. Andrew, David.
I also want to start by thinking about that word faith and then add to the historical story that both Anya and Andy have started that's implicit in that word still, that marks a moment of crisis and change in higher education in the United States. And as I was thinking about this prompt, it struck me that there are other words that Alan might have given us. Can we still have hope in the academy? I mean, the answer would have been, from me, a pretty straightforward yes, and talk about why. Can we still have trust in the academy? The answer for me would have been no, and it's for really interesting reasons that we need to unpack. My answer to the question, can we still have faith in the academy, is no and yes, depending on what we mean by faith. If we mean a kind of trust in the institutional and the intellectual authority of the academy to perform the mission that Andy nicely summarized, I think the answer is no, and we're already starting to tell some of the reasons for how, as an institutional sector, higher education has failed to continue to earn that authority. But if we mean Paul's faith is belief in the substance of things unseen, then I would say the answer is yes, because we can't simply stop at the narrative of crisis, but need to say what kind of future of as yet unseen things do we need to build, and what kinds of resources and assets has the academy still provided us with in order to remake higher ed institutions. So let me unpack why I have faith in the substance of things unseen. Anya and Andy have both stressed this moment of crisis as a moment in which the economics business plan of higher ed is unsustainable, and Anya has been a leader and for me a teacher in thinking about the role of student debt as surfacing the unsustainability of that hockey stick path that we're on. But I also want to say that the moment that we're in is not simply one of economic and fiscal crisis. And in fact, I would argue that's not even the most important dimension of the crisis. We're in a legitimation crisis in higher education. Higher education as a sector depends on massive amounts of resources and autonomy accorded it by the larger society. And there's always implicitly a social compact over what justifies handing over so many resources and so much autonomy, especially since the period of the Truman Commission and the GI Bill. We've had a very strong story about why the higher education is a good for the society that deserves its autonomy and its resources. And that story, that social compact, has broken down, especially in the past 20 years. It's partly broken down because the conditions of the work that we're doing have changed so radically. 2 data points capture this wonderfully. Almost 2/3 of all students in the United States who attain bachelor's degrees attend more than one institution. And the credits that they earn are taught about 2/3 by non-tenure stream faculty. So they are not the student body in the same developmental moment, gathered together in compact and set-aside campus places that we think of as the norm of the traditional model of undergraduate education. And their teachers are not the teachers that we think of in the traditional model of education. And those teachers have been trained in a system of disciplinary hyper-specialization and peer review that has valued research as judged by other peer reviewers over others. That whole system has become untenable. And the large-scale debates that we've been having over the last 10 years or 20 years from the culture wars to the current debates over whether a baccalaureate education is worth the resources that it takes are signs of this large unfolding crisis of legitimacy. So the moment that we're facing is not one in which there's a powerful, stuck, dominant paradigm that we have to overthrow. It's where there is a formerly dominant paradigm that is breaking down of its own weight, and we are figuring out what the future will be that will replace it. Not necessarily a future without higher ed institutions, but shaped very differently, convening students very differently, organizing curricula and co-curricula differently, hiring and organizing faculty and other teachers, not only faculty, very differently. And at the same time, we confront this change. And so that's, I've just given you my version of the gloomiest account of this crisis. It's not only fiscal, it's legitimacy, the bargain between higher ed and the society is broken down. But 2 very important things are happening, that one that is unfolding right now in real time and the other that's about 10 or 20 years old that changed the situation. One is a set of new practices driven especially by new technologies and by new ideals of horizontal teaching and learning practices that transcend institutional boundaries, the world of MOOCs and badging and credentials, that is challenging all of the practices of the way we organize higher education. And it's not exactly clear what the academy would look like that is organized solely around those practices. But the other one, and we talk a lot about that, about MOOCs and digital education and the like. The other one is a 20-year story of what is sometimes called in our trade the development of high-impact practices, learning communities, capstone courses, civic engagement, and community-based learning, globalized learning that happened against the grain of this dominant paradigm, but that's been enormously generative and often overlooked in accounts of this crisis. I think we will make a new set of models out of some dialogue between those two strands of change, between the counter-normative high-impact practices that have been developed on campuses and the forces of new horizontal and technological change. And when we do that, my own sense, and here's why I return to the answer, yes, I have faith in the substance of things unseen, is that we will find indispensable gifts to the notion of compact higher ed institutions, not as retreats from the world of the marketplace and of citizenship, but of places of reflective practice, of apprenticeship, of teaching and learning from which to engage this future world. In that sense, I'm not among the most radical who see the dissolving of institutional boundaries and giving way to a kind of networked, self-organized, crowdsourced learning. I think we will lose important practices of teaching and learning and gathering in place from which to engage the world. And because of that, I have faith in the academy.
Okay, thank you, David. And Angus.
Thanks very much. I suppose the sense in which I'm going to talk about the loss of faith in the academy, I think, is in our loss of faith in the traditional great books, the canon, to tell us something useful about the truths of being human. And I think we've become ruptured from the past in a way that doesn't actually usefully let us engage with the present. I think we end up being stuck in the now, and we're always asking, what is the academy for, not what it is. And the list of things that it's meant to be for are very long. I mean, they go from eliminating racism, sexism, elitism, making our the workers of tomorrow have the right skills base for a fast-changing global environment, etc. There are a lot of things that we're told that it's for, and we're making better citizens. We're much less capable, I think, of saying what it is or what it should be. There used to be answers that it was a place where, you know, a community of scholars would come together in pursuit of the truth, and that they would seclude themselves from the demands of relevance. And not to become irrelevant, but to get that space and time around them to try and unify human knowledge. That was the clues in the name. It's a university. I was going to talk a little bit about Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind that Alan mentioned, and I think that he, you must forgive me, although I'm going to defend in a way tradition, I'm going to do it in a non-traditional way with an iPad because I couldn't bring my ink pot over from London. But the Bloom in that book, I think, which I have a lot of sympathy with, defends or tries to defend the way in which he said that the knowledge explosion post-war had emptied out college years rather than filled them, the huge diversity of subjects, the research specialization, and the lack of a shared experience that you could talk about. If we all read Moby Dick, and Andrew tells us it's a great book, we have a standard being put forward, backed by Andrew's authority, which we can then debate and discuss, and we've got something we can all discuss together. Of course, Bloom is lamenting the destruction, if you like, or the explosion of that canonicity, the questioning of the very idea that it's okay to make normative judgments, to say this is a better book than something else. And, you know, it's a gloomy book, The Closing of the American Mind. You're probably familiar with it. I was going to just take a slightly different tack. 2 years before it, there was a novel published called White Noise by Don DeLillo. I don't know if people have read that. It kind of brought him into the literary scene in America. It's a story about a professor in a Midwestern college called the College on the Hill. Jack Gladney is the man, and he's about to inaugurate the first world conference of a novelty discipline he's invented called Hitler Studies. So he's trying to bring history into the modern world, give it a gloss of newness and freshness. He's invented Hitler Studies. He's very, very nervous about this inaugural conference, however, because our faithless professor, faithless to traditional history, if you like, has a guilty secret as well, as that he can't read or write German. Which, for a professor of Hitler Studies, is something of a drawback. He's desperately trying to learn it very quickly before the other delegates turn up. He's also got another big problem, is that he's desperately afraid of his own mortality. And he's trying to get hold of a drug called Mylar, which will help him come to terms with the inevitability of his death. I.e., on a metaphorical level, he's desperately concerned that his life, his commitment to academia, will end up being in the past, and the past is somehow a place of irrelevance. And I think this is the way things have been turned around. The book ends, he's faithless in another way. He's not looking after his responsibility to his son, which is, education in a large part is to take responsibility for the next generation and passing on to them the great things that the insights we've managed to glean through the centuries. Jack Gladney is too obsessed with Hitler Studies to notice that his son is tricycling over the interstate. Only a miracle saves him. And I suppose what that book is telling us is that maybe only a miracle will save the academy as traditionally constituted. How am I doing for time? I don't know how long that story went.
You've got time, a minute and a half.
Good, a minute and a half. Hannah Arendt, who I believe was at this fine institution, talked about the educational crisis in 1960, and she said that the fundamental paradox that we've got to cope with is that education, by its very nature, must be structured by authority and tradition. And it must, especially in the humanities, look to the past. It must try and conserve for the next generation what the previous generations have learned, as I said, but that today is structured neither by authority nor tradition. So the question for me is, how do we respond to that situation? And I think, much as when love affairs come to an end, there's never any going back. If you've lost faith in the academy, if we've dispensed with the canon of dead white men, you can't just reassert it. I mean, people try and do that, but it becomes a very brittle defense of something that we know that is lost. I think, though, that there is maybe a way of trying to do that. Maybe, I wouldn't say fleeing from the academy or experimenting with new methods of learning and so on. We should be traditional in some senses. It would be good to talk about students rather than consumers. It would be good to hand out reading lists rather than pick and mix modules. I think that's good. I think there is a role for the public authority, the public intellectual, rather than the professional expert. And I think it's good to meet them in the flesh rather than just online and be in a community of often, disagreement, because that's the fundamental thing for me. I think that we've become avowedly non-judgmental, to pick up where I started. I think that if we reappropriate to ourselves the right to be canonical and find the freedom that's required to make judgments about whether this is right or wrong, true or false, whether it's knowledge or just information, then I think that is, in a way, a foundational activity. When you discriminate and say this is good and that's not, you actually create a standard that could be democratically accessible to everybody else. Right? It's when you refuse to make a judgment and you say, hey man, that's just my perspective, who are you to tell me that Moby Dick's a good book, then there is actually no possibility of any transmission of knowledge you might as well really not be in the room, because you haven't created the possibility of any kind of a standard. So I think that, in a way, is where we would have to start if we want to recreate the idea of faith, is in a funny way with making judgments, playing God, if you like.
Okay, thank you, Angus, and thank you to all the speakers. I want to ask a question straight off the back of that, really, because Andrew, in your book, when you talk about the etymology of the word university and where it's come from, the universal, the universal discussion of things, and all of the knowledge that could be possibly put in there. And Anya, as well, in your book, you also talk about the fact that more is not necessarily better, and there's been an obsession about getting numbers into education, but it's not always about it being better. But when we were conceiving of this idea of faith in the academy and what it means, partly it was a discussion of what has happened. I think that Angus was touching on it at the end, about the relationship between knowledge and a body of knowledge, and the kind of, on the one hand, what's happened with pick and mix courses, and also that something that's happened politically, and that people talk about the culture wars, but the increasing relativization, or almost like the postmodern moment. And to what extent should the university be a place where you could say this is a place that represents knowledge and can have faith in that as an institution, or is it something that can't be that, and it has to be something that has to, as you point towards the end of your book, Anya, that it's really going to have to be now a place that's digitized and different relationship now in this new contemporary moment. I'd like you to come back on that first, please, Anya.
Sure. I think that most people inhabit a reality now where the meaning of what it is to know something has fundamentally changed, because we are all constantly able to access the world mind in our pockets. And our traditional means of it's important to make the distinction, yes, between knowledge and information, but the ability to reference the world's knowledge has to change our concept of what knowledge is. And it certainly changes it might not remove your ability as, the provost of a department, or the provost of a university or a dean of a department, to give people a reading list, but it certainly removes your ability to promulgate the fiction that is the only reading list. We're living in a world of infinite reading lists, and we all have to figure out how to navigate that. And I think one of the biggest skills that that educators are now entrusted with is to give what's often called in the technological world crap detection, right? So people need to have a really good way of discerning what's important, what isn't, what's true and what isn't. These are basic, abilities that we purport to offer people in a critical thinking context in the liberal arts, in the kind of education that I got as an undergraduate. None of it had to do with memorizing a specific list of facts or facts versus other facts. It all had to do with really processes of knowledge and processes of the mind, which were in fact brought out with people's encounters with each other and people's encounters with the text. And I don't think that any of that is confined to the face-to-face. I think the face-to-face has certain interesting affordances for it. I think that the online world has certain interesting affordances for it. But if you don't start with the premise that, the classroom has become an increasingly artificial place, because it's the only place, as Will Richardson points out in his latest book, it's the only place left where you're not allowed to look up the answers. And what does it mean to live in a place where you can always look up the answers? What does it mean to know things?
So are you saying that it's a fiction that there is a list, a canon, let's say in literature, for instance, in English?
That's certainly what I was taught as a literature major. I mean, I came in at the death of the canon, and that was the gospel that I was brought up with, so I'm just parroting it.
Right. Andrew?
Well, lots of things to say. One, just maybe detached observation, is that I think it's ironic that our colleagues in the sciences really are much less conflicted about all of this. I mean, it's still the case that if you're going to study chemistry or mathematics or any other division of the sciences, the faculty is really quite comfortable telling you what you need to do first and what you need to do second. and how to measure your mastery as you move along. So I think the degree in which we're talking about an existential either crisis or opportunity, depending on how we look at it, is rather different in the sciences. And that's worth noting, I think, because the modern research university, in my view, has been driven largely by the success of science, both the intellectual success and its ability to bring funds into the institution. As for the question of the canon, I mean, you know, I fall on the traditionalist side of this spectrum and responded with, I thought Angus's comments were actually quite moving. But I take a sort of pragmatic view of the matter. I say to my students when I give them my course in American literature, I say, look, this is my reading list. It's perfectly true that somebody else's reading list may be quite different. And I'm not making any proclamations about the quality of these books. At the end of the day, it's really going to be about how you experience them. My reading list is a manifestation of a certain kind of faith of my own, which is that the books that I'm going to inflict on you or give you the opportunity to experience are actually going to work for you. Something's going to happen. You're going to have a transformative experience if you're fortunate. And I've been doing this now for 25 or 30 years, and I find that certain books are more likely to help deliver that experience than others. And I actually have, you know, I live and work in a peculiar place which still has a prescribed curriculum of great books, but I find very little pushback from the students about this. And I also find a certain gratitude that precisely the peculiarity of the classroom as sort of the last space where somebody hands out this kind of authoritative assertion to you is quite welcome to them. You know, they spend the rest of their waking and even sleeping hours in a universe where the sensory input is continuous and uninterrupted and from all different directions and undiscriminated. They seem to rather like going into a space where there's, you know, one person talking and then there's a silence and then a question. And so I think there's something to be said for keeping the university sequestered, if not cloistered.
Yeah, David, I just want, on that point as well, because Anya mentions crap detection, and actually there's a nice charming quote in Andrew's book about detecting rot early on, and what a formal education previously meant in higher education, and knowledge and diligence. And he also makes a comment about a quarter of undergraduates now coming in who can't comprehend a reasonably sophisticated magazine. Is it the case that there should be something about standards and quality, an old-fashioned argument that perhaps Angus is saying you can't go back to in some ways, or should it be more of the sort of stuff that, you know, you were pointing to some of the things in your piece about other types of experiences alongside formal education? So
let me partly answer that question, but do it by kidnapping it back into the exchange that Andy and Angus and Anya were having, because I want to tease apart what feel to me like some red herrings in the canon discussion from the real issues that were there. With respect to Angus and maybe also to Andy, I would say that the notion of stable canonicity was always a fiction long before the emergence of the internet and the world mind that Anya was referencing. If you had been a literature professor in 1920 and had suggested that Moby Dick was a canonical text in American literature, you would have been laughed out of the classroom. John Greenleaf Whittier was the canonical text at that moment in the teaching of American history. If you had been a medieval university student in Bologna in the 13th century, you would have from the start been negotiating the curriculum with your faculty. So there's an ideal of canonicity that's constantly being contested, and I would suggest that the moment that we're in now is not the one where some canonical body of texts has been challenged, but where the notion of the curriculum as it is being challenged. That is to say, a kind of temporally and topically structured set of things to learn, itself always contested, always under struggle, but where the shape of a curriculum organized into semesters, organized into courses, where faculty and student labor is being allocated, that's what's breaking down in this moment. And when we think of new practices, whether it's project-based learning or intensive modules or the kind of distributed technologically networked practices that Anya often talks about in her work, it's the notion that whatever fights we are having about the canon, we can contain them within the structure of a curriculum. That's part of what we have come to challenge. When I've done historical research into what medieval and Renaissance universities, like, the forms of instruction are incredibly similar to the forms that up until 5 years ago, 12 to 15 week semesters, courses with titles, a single professor with a group of students. When we look forward into things unseen, that will be the great test of the structures. And that, again, with respect to my colleagues who are arguing what's sometimes called the traditionalist line, that's a way more important, way more consequential fight than whether or not we read Moby Dick or not.
But just a question on this, because a friend of mine who is a lecturer, a professor at one of the fairly well-known universities in Britain 10 years ago said to his students, I'm going to just tell you how I work. Everybody's got to read this stuff on the reading list. You've all got to hand your work in on time, and if you don't, that's going to be a problem. And the next day he was called in front of the dean's office. And so I suppose what my question is that that sort of links into the idea, you're saying that there's this notion of canon has always been flexible and malleable, but there has been a significant shift and change in the recent period around modularization, around what even knowledge constitutes and means.
I was making a historical point that there has always been radical contestation about what knowledge counts and what it means. And what we take for granted as the traditionalist view from the vantage point of the quadrivium and the trivium would look unrecognizable. It's true that the stakes of that are always important. There are always stakes about the standard of what counts as good knowledge, good question asking, the kinds of things that students need to learn in order to be free from superstition, to be free for their full human development. Those are absolutely key questions. But the notion that there was a stable answer to those questions that has radically broken down in the last 10 years compared to the earlier period, I think is a historical fiction. Other things have broken down.
I know you want to speak, but I'm going to
come back on just some of those points? Because I entirely agree that the canon has never been stable. I guess what I'm saying is that it was because of its canonicity that it was open to being overthrown. And in the absence of a canon, you can't decide what should be in it and what should not be in it. And you do end up in the position that Anya's parodying of an infinite number of lists, and it evaporates out into a flat world. When you do have a statement made by society that these are canonical, you create the possibility of disagreement with that judgment and the possibility thereby of Moby Dick getting in. And it should be flexible, but it should not be thrown open to play with, because then you end up really with a kind of a carnival sideshow. What Anya refers to as crap detection, Matthew Arnold called the notion of a touchstone. If we introduce young people in that rite of passage into adulthood to a classic text, then we're holding it up saying we think this is good, and they have a standard that they can orient themselves towards. They by no means have to agree, but they should be able to say why they disagree and make an account of themselves and grow in that process. Finally, I think the odd thing is that when the canon got thrown out with the baby in the bathwater, we didn't end up with the promise that was given of a kind of radical explosion of heterodox beliefs. I think we ended up with a really incredible orthodoxy and conformity where people don't want to stick their heads above the parapet. To be slightly provocative, to give you an example, if you're on, I don't know, a course in women's studies and gender studies, and you're studying that and you raise a question, say, I don't know, might it be the case that women would be more fulfilled and happier staying at home with their children? I think you'll find that people are very, very judgmental about your opinion. That's not a course organized to give free play to viewpoints. And it can end up in kind of non-courses. I was up at Columbia this morning, Andrew. My little brother is studying there, and I was trying to find his department. Going down the list, I found contemporary black history. I noticed there wasn't black physics, but I know it's not considered very polite to say these kind of things these days, but maybe we should just think about some of these ideas. What's contemporary history? I'm not really sure, but it's not history.
Could I?
See what Anya was going to say.
Oh,
something
okay,
when you-
sure.
And then I'm going to come over to you guys in a minute,
Yeah.
so you can start indicating, and you don't have to just ask questions, you can make points. So start raising your hands.
I mean, I think a lot of these points are really great, and I love this idea. I totally agree with you that it's not just canons or syllabi that are in question, but it's curricula that is in question. And I don't see it's a question of shoulds. I think it's a question of what is happening. But just the observation that came to me, we kind of passed over this pretty quickly, but we talked about a fundamental function of the university being basically adolescents passing to adulthood or people becoming socialized, becoming full citizens. And the fact is that that function is dramatically changed because the average age of the college student is 26. So you've got adults basically learning, and adults don't like to be subjects of pedagogy. Pedagogy is for children, and the implications of free adults engaging in inquiry is very, very interesting. The idea of how people are going to become adults if they don't have the money or the time to be in college when they're young is a very tough question. I think it's one that is being answered in our prisons, it's being answered in our military, in a lot of places besides school. But, as we consider the evolving functions of the academy, I think it's really, to me, really useful to think about what does it mean for adults to learn together.
But you do say in your book, when you're summing up, that the promise of DIY university, it's the promise of universal and university education, but it can only be achieved by leaving the university. Mm-hmm. So, okay.
Yeah, I mean, there isn't a place for everyone in the university. We were once the most educated country in the world. Now we're the 10th most educated. And the growth has come, I mean, people are going to college in much greater numbers now, but the growth, that most of them don't graduate, or many of them don't graduate. Close to half of a four-year program don't graduate. So the growth in demand for higher education has completely outstripped our ability to provide seats to people. And so instead, unless we think about providing it very, very differently, it's not going to be provided.
But when you talk about that, you also make the point that quality is often an issue, and how you can assess and judge and evaluate that. And so if that's the new university where you have students choosing what they want and sort of guiding one another and that type of thing, and it takes it away from the idea of what the university is, how do you retain, if one is want to, the thing that is substantive and of value within the university?
Well, I think what's so beautiful about it is, we've got on this panel extremely distinguished professors with many, many degrees and incredible authority. If Andy tells me to read a list of books, I'm going to go out and read them. I'm going to go and I'm going to read Moby Dick. But I'm on this panel too, and I only have a bachelor's degree. And that's because I put forth some ideas that people found interesting and valuable. And I think there is a universe of free contest of thought, and people are going to engage in the life of the mind because that's a very human thing to do. And I think the quality comes to the forefront in those conversations.
I endorse that last sentiment. I think the gildishness of the university is something that's always been excessive, and some of the best teachers that we have uptown don't even have a BA degree. But I predicted that we would talk a lot about technology, and we haven't really done that. So I wanted to just go back to something that David said when he pointed out that, I think you said until a very few years ago, the way the university conceived of itself and operated was very much the way it did in the Middle Ages. Now, there's an economist out in Ohio who likes to tell a joke that I think works pretty well on the banquet circuit, in which he says, with the possible exception of prostitution, teaching is the only activity that has enjoyed no productivity advance in the 2,400 years since Socrates. Now, I thought we'd just spend 30 seconds on that. It's true. But the question is whether the joke doesn't undercut the point that he's trying to make. That is, there are probably some activities that are best done the old-fashioned way. And if you're a consumer, I agree we should use the word student rather than customer or consumer, but if you're a consumer of either of these activities, you're probably not going to make your judgment of value based on the economy of scale or the productivity of the teacher or the provider of the other service. But to be more serious, I think, again, without putting words into anybody else's mouth other than my own, the implication of a lot of what's being said about our moment is that we may, in fact, be at the first moment when this is going to change, when we have a technology that is going to improve the productivity capability of higher education. Take the MOOC, for example. So when Professor Thrun at Stanford decided to take his introductory robotics course, or whatever it was, out of the classroom and put it online, he went from an enrollment of 150 to an enrollment of 150,000. Now that's pretty impressive. And the implications of that we cannot evade, and we should not evade. But the difficult problem is how to translate that expansion of contact, connection, or whatever it is, and there's a lot we don't know about it, right? I mean, a very, very large percentage of those 150,000 students didn't finish. It's very hard to know what they learned. It's very hard to know what an ill-prepared student, who are the ones we should be most concerned about, will be able to learn in this online relationship. A lot of unanswered questions. And one of them is, can any of the things that Angus and I have been talking about be successfully translated into this new world? Can that irreplaceable face-to-face experience where the teacher's been looking you in the eye and has actually been listening to you for a semester and learning what's on your mind, can that be replicated online? And some of the people up here will say yes, and others of us will say we're not so sure.
Okay, so I've got Angus and then David, and then start putting your hands up, guys.
I'm just thinking about what Andy just said. The problem sometimes, I think, is that we try again and validate the traditional academy or the ideal of it by saying how much access can we give to it, how many people can we get involved in it, and technology is a kind of dream of doing that. But sometimes I think we also have to remember that in an important sense, education is not for the students. Actually, they might be something that are there but as a source of potential benefit to knowledge. There is a sense in which the academics have traditionally picked out bright young things from the student body and said, one day would you, maybe some of you, like to be like us and become people who look after and conserve and pass on that body of knowledge. So I suppose I'm saying academics should maybe love knowledge first and the students second, which is to take the discussion out of the how, whether it's books or technology, and I don't want to be Luddite about it at all. It's all good, but we just have to remember that these subjects academic disciplines are not for everyone, and that's no stigma. You don't have to do an academic degree to get a job, and you may not want to. And sometimes the people who are forced into it because they've been convinced somehow that it's terribly relevant to them, or as happens now, that they'll just get some sort of well-being. They'll be happy at the end, and once they've filled in enough happiness surveys in the course of their 3 years at college, that will have made it worthwhile. We should just maybe remember that, it's the subject that we have to love first, and the knowledge itself.
David, I do want to ask you, the thing about authority and tradition, is it the case, do you agree with the premise that authority has eroded and corroded for the idea of the professor, for the idea of the body of the university? Firstly, do you think that has happened? And is that a good thing in terms of changing the paradigm in a kind of multiplicity of ways of learning, or is that problematic?
I think, yes, a certain model. I mean, earlier models of the authority of the professor had already broken down in the face of, say, the emergence of sort of disciplinary specialized research universities and that notion of technical expert authority. That model of authority is breaking down. We're living through that, and I think there are all kinds of goods that come from that, but I actually think the main thing is what Anya said. It is what is happening, and we need to think, what kind of communities of practice and learning do we want to make? And I guess I would, I'm actually, I may be the only person up here who's taking MOOCs at this point, or maybe not. I signed up for 2 humanities MOOCs, canonical subjects, modern and contemporary poetry and Greek mythology, precisely to see what this platform could do for kind of classic humanities teaching and learning, which which I love and am deeply committed to. And for me, the lesson, I'm totally in favor of us experimenting with this. I don't want to gatekeep this. I think we're at the beginning of a lot of experimentation. So far, my experience is totally underwhelming. And it's not because of onlineness. It's because online teaching and learning is plenty capable of pulling together transformative communities of learning that are transformative in ways that face-to-face classrooms aren't. People can be different kinds of people from the way they're coded around the classroom. It's the massiveness of it that erodes the capacity for either digital or face-to-face learning communities. For me, it's community that is the key term, not authority and tradition, that makes transformative learning possible and that allows fights over authority and tradition, which are the substance of teaching and learning.
Okay, but I mean, Anya, in your book you talk about how everyone has seen the writing on the wall with the news publishing industry and publishing generally, and that information can be disseminated a lot in many different ways, and this is what's happening online. But is there something different between information and knowledge? Is it something that, you just put some stuff out on MOOCs, or is there something that happens when you go to a place like the university that's something that's different from logging on to something when you can fit it in a kind of pick and mix, do it when you can? Is there a qualitative difference, or is it all just the same? You're just getting access more out to more people?
Well, I think, first of all, the type of university education that Angus talks about, I don't think is that much in danger. There's 4,000 institutions in the United States, and maybe 200 of them have enough money in the bank to keep going, even after the fall of the United States. Cities last much longer than empires, and certain bulwarks of elite higher education are going to outlast all of us. And so I'm not that worried about all of that. I mean, the real issue is that we're all kind of talking about is the idea of the universality of the gift of higher knowledge and what that means to allow people to massively engage in learning. This is a postmodern problem. It's not just a problem of the internet age. The internet age, what it does is it provides us new ways of thinking about how to do it. And I think that it's very, very, I talk about we talked about the word university a lot. The word college I talk about in my book as being, it comes from this idea of collegiality and community, essentially, right? And so this is a huge issue, and I think community is a buzzword in the world of the internet, which I spend a lot of my time in. And people talk all the time about forming communities, social networks, community managers are being hired by, online companies. And so everyone's very, very concerned about this. What it means is that you have people to talk about ideas with, and that's where knowledge and learning really emerges from. I think that can happen online. I think the online world can serve as a convener for the real world. What we have to stop, if we're going to scale this, what we have to stop doing is thinking of that as something that always has to travel through the bottleneck of a particular group of people who are the authorities on it, because the fact is they'll never have enough classrooms for everyone.
Okay, so I'm going to take people, but can you come up to the microphones just so they can hear your questions? It's going to go out, we're filming. And you can make your comments. They don't have to be a question. You could go either side. And I think about the question of whether this is all liberating us from a dead hand of tradition, or that's too much of a dichotomy, and this is just a new process, part of a combination of different elements. I'm interested to hear what you guys think about that. Yeah.
I'd like to make a comment about two different things. And the first one is, Anya comments is that, you know, these are adult learners and they are not looking for authority. That contradicts my own experience. So I'm an academic. At the moment, I'm at Brooke College at the City University of New York. I've spent my career teaching professional master students, almost all of whom work in the industry. They're getting a degree in public administration or public policy. They're very, very busy people, both professionally and in their personal lives, and commuting and families and so on. And they are absolutely looking to me to structure the knowledge, tell them what is most important, what is the easiest route to understanding. Yes, they want to think for themselves, or at least a certain number of them do, and I try and convince them that that's what they all need. But they do want things very much structured. They want help. They want things laid out as much as possible. And I think that you know, I really appreciated the book DIYU, and I think there are a lot of important things, but it's enormously costly to navigate this chaos out there, and I think that's something people really look for. The second thing I wanted to comment on is the pushback against, you know, it's not all economics, it's not about boosting your income, it's not about the job market. For the vast majority of people, particularly those for whom it's not a consumption good or a prestige good, that's what it is about, and I think we need to respect their views and what they want. They're making large sacrifices in money and time and so on. I would like for them to not make such large sacrifices, but I think we have to accept their motivation and their desires.
Okay, thank you. Yep, Jean Smith.
Well, I have a bit of a problem with this discussion, and I think it's important that we separate the material side from what you might call the mental side, because I think there are some things that I never thought I'd hear myself say this, that throwing money at the problem won't solve. Because it seems that if you look at something like the, you know, because Anya, you referred to the fact that, you know, student loans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you look at something like the GI Bill and something like the British grammar school system, of which I am a product, I think the idea of that was about giving access to people who weren't from privileged backgrounds to a really, really good education, and expecting the students to rise to the standard that you know, that students from more privileged families would achieve. And it seems that what's happening now is something different, in that in an attempt to be inclusive and involve more students in the academy, we're doing a couple of things. We're actually lowering our expectations of what we expect of the students. I mean, I don't know why students are being admitted if they have to do remedial classes. You know, if they can't write an essay with correct grammar, et cetera, et cetera. You know, maybe there should be a college phase for, you know, what we used to call the access classes. But I think that the thing that's different today, I think, is that the value that we give to education has diminished. So the whole lowering of what we expect from students and the lowering of standards in terms of who we admit into the academy is all part of the fact that, as a society, we've lost sense of what education is for. You know, education for, you know, and learning for the sake of learning, about giving meaning to the human experience. And I'm wondering whether that's because, you know, which relates to some of the points that the panelists have been making about the fact that we feel uncomfortable, you know, with our cultural legacy, because education is supposed to be about passing on the cultural legacy to the next generation, and that generation will build on that cultural legacy and take it forward so that they can give it on to the next generation. And it seems that because we've lost confidence in what we might call our collective cultural legacy, and we've lost sense of, you know, what education is for in terms of giving meaning to the human experience, that's part of the problem, and that's why, part of the reason why we're now accepting people into the academy who can't write an essay. And not only that, it's an insult to to students, because there's no reason why you can't give the students the remedial classes outside of the academy that they have to work hard for and struggle to be able to pass, so that then they're good enough to be in the academy. Because otherwise, we have this sense that the academy is being leveled down, instead of what you would hope would be that the academy would all the time be, rising and rising and rising through the generations.
Thank you. Yep, over there.
I find the panel somewhat pessimistic in that they don't appreciate, and I think the previous speaker mentioned this about a cultural legacy, and that if we do have faith in the academy, it's only because of the impact on our cultural heritage, and not our heritage, but our present culture. Our present culture is quite valuable as compared to prior cultures, and it's built on prior cultures. It supports revolutions into communism and then back again into a free market concept. These are huge advances which would never be made without academic study. And I feel that we have to not only think about the faith in the academy, but the purpose that the academy serves.
Okay, thanks. Why don't we got one more there?
I just want to say I would heartily recommend Professor Delbanco's book, College. Excellent book. One of the things it mentions in there is just the broader purposes of a college and college education. I guess the question I've got is, if anything, since I guess around the time your book was published, the discussion really is gone even further in the direction of how, what will it mean getting a college education for a job? And I guess in this kind of environment, where it's still really tough, there's the student debt issue and all that, how do we raise the, I guess you might, relevancy of some of these things that have been discussed by lots of people about the need for having a space where we're looking at issues, and it's not purely about necessarily a direct link to what we're going to earn. And in particular, I was struck in the book about, in the past, the concept that one of the aims of a university was to encourage certain virtues and a sense of duty and honor. And I kind of wonder if that's like kind of something we might see that actually has had an impact on our society. You're talking maybe as a ruling class, as it were. We've had a meritocracy, which is all very good about getting grades and filling in tests, but as a group of people that actually lead our society, are they lacking today in certain understanding of virtue? And that's because it no longer constitutes, say, a coherent class background that was trained in certain virtues.
Okay.
Could I,
Yep, go for it.
just besides saying thank you for the kind comment, thinking back to one of the previous speakers who was from, I think, Baruch College, who said we need to respect the motivation of many students today, that they want to know what they're going to see at the end of this investment in terms of practical matter. I think no one can or should disagree with that, and I think we should respect our students. But I don't see that this is an either-or situation. Of course, we want to prepare students for productive, functional lives in this rapidly changing market. But we also want to respect their aspiration to be reflective, thoughtful, informed human beings with some perspective on the world in which they live, and do what we can as individuals and as institutions to help them achieve that. And it may be that they can achieve a lot of it through the means that Anya speaks about, But I have the sense that, that we can do both. Let me give you a very quick example. I'm visiting a campus, not an elite campus. I met with a young man who's a business major. And I didn't challenge his wish to accrue the skills and the credits he needed to go into the business that he was aspiring to go into. But we got into a conversation about the first episode of Mad Men, which is not exactly a canonical text, and I confess the only episode of Mad Men I've ever seen. But it's the one, right, in which these young fast-track advertising guys discover that they have a problem, which is they can no longer put the guy in the white coat playing the doctor saying, smoke more, the more cigarettes you smoke, the better you'll be, right? It'll soothe your throat, it'll calm your nerves, you'll live longer, because there's this incontrovertible evidence that it's actually killing people. So they need to figure out how are they going to sell cigarettes and skirt that issue. And so it becomes an episode about a very significant moral question. And this young man became very engaged in that conversation, and I had the sense that if he, in his course in marketing, you know, there was somebody with a philosophical background who might bring in a couple of texts to talk about the obligations that human beings have to one another. He would be quite engaged by that discussion and might emerge actually better equipped to do the job that he's training for than otherwise. So I resist the either or is what I'm trying to say.
Okay. Angus?
Yeah, just because it follows on from that, I mean, two things occur to me. One, it's remarkable that we have a very profound hostility to meritocracy today, which just strikes me as really odd. Everybody always talks about equality and access, and just does run away from making standards. But without a standard, you can't include in any meaningful way, because you can't exclude. That seems an important logical point, if nothing else, that we should remember. The second one is that I actually think the Academy is incredibly guilty of pandering to a cult of youth, if you like. I don't mean to disparage the idea that people need skills to get jobs. Of course they do, but research study after research study has shown that it's not at university you get those skills. Even in the very hardest of hard sciences, you need at most 1 or 2 years before you can go out and get a job in robotics. You just do not need an academic discipline to do that. That's not the purpose of the Academy. And the way in which the Academy, I think, is trying to deal with the institutional crisis of authority we're talking about is by trying to refresh itself at the expense of young people's aspirations, in a way, to buy into a cult of, we'll do something relevant for your tomorrow, and we'll talk to who you are and your individual background, and the fact that you're black means that you go into the contemporary black history course rather than being transformed into something else. And so that fascination with the future always changing means that the university is always changing, never stable, never a chance to learn anything. And the sad thing is that the only freedom these young minds are given is actually freedom from education, a freedom from authoritative professors telling them what to think or even what to think about. They're given a freedom from education, if anything, which is an absolute tragedy, I think, and their lives are, in a way, their time in college is effectively wasted. That's just, maybe if we could find a way of turning away from that, you know, kind of fake legitimacy of associating ourselves with youth, and remember that the job of the Academy, at least in the ideal form, is to tell young people about the world. And the world, as Arendt put it, is always older than we are. So that's why you have to look back.
You know, David, in Britain we had something called Access for Education, Access for All. And it was presented as an egalitarian thing that would get many more people into university. But actually what it ended up doing was downgrading many of the universities to the level of polytechnics. And it did a number of things. Obviously there was something political behind it. It was an attempt to massage unemployment figures and stuff like that. But at its core, rather than raising up the standard and the quality for everyone, as I think Jean was making a point that perhaps it could do, it ended up having that impact. Arthur Levine, in his piece in the New York Times on digital learning, makes an interesting point as well, that he says that today a lot of students have been highly graded, almost overgraded quite a lot of the time, by the time they get to the university. And that sort of culture of saying, you know, you're not good enough but you have to get to this point, seems to be, you know, sometimes you get a trophy for showing up to certain things. I mean, what do we think about that?
I think I think there are 3 or 4 different questions smushed together in that comment. There's the challenge if you share, as I do, the notion that however we think of education, having it be a core experience of democratic citizenship is essential to the health of a society. If you start with that ethical commitment, the question of how you massively provide the opportunity for the kind of learning and learning communities that we want to have is a challenging one. I mean, it's an experiment that has succeeded in some very important ways in the United States, and I would argue in Britain, and has also failed in some ways. I mean, we're still in the middle of it. So I think one of the issues that your comment raises is about how do you scale up the experience of what you think of as fabulous education, however we argue about what fabulous education is. There's a second point, which I have to confess, although Gene and you and I work together on lots of stuff, and I love that. There's a discourse of sullying the academy as a sacred space by making sure that students who are unevenly prepared or ill-prepared don't enter its precincts. I'm just not in sympathy with that way of understanding either those students or the academy. I want an academy, most of all in its moments of engaging the essential human questions, to be a place that is both apart from the world and a part of the world. And it needs to be permeable enough to be constantly being sullied by things in the world in order to do the work of reflection and the creation of wisdom. And I lead a division, one of whose missions is to train what I call the new majority students that Anya referenced later, the students who are older, who are not in college as part of a post-adolescent developmental task, who are mixing work and community and family and trying to fit education in. They are the majority of undergraduates in the United States, and we are creating a student peer leadership program, and I'm teaching the seminar. What's striking with this very small and anecdotal cohort is how seamlessly they link making a life, all of the kind of questions of what it means to be human for them, making a living, and community and citizenship. And for them, these are seamless projects. They don't ask the question, do I want to do learning for learning's sake or to get a job? They don't see community engagement as at odds with their own professional aspirations. In fact, in confused, muddled, kind of exploratory ways, they're always braiding these things together, and we want an academy that helps them to do that.
Okay, are there any final questions or points that anyone wants to raise? Because I'm going to come to the panel for final summarizing points. So has anyone got a burning question or point they want to make for the panel before I come back to them? Okay, so Anya.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I'm really pleased with everything, a lot of what people have said here tonight. And I guess, my parting thought is that I really have come to see over, the 2 years since I published DIYU, a lot of what, David talked about, high impact, I think is really, really important as we think about how is the evolution of learning going to proceed, taking as an assumption that this is a universal human attribute and desire, and it's not going to be stopped even if the institutions in which it takes place are very differently constituted. So what then do we do with the existing infrastructure that was designed for a very different world? I think that the idea of the ultimate hybridization of every university experience where people are learning online and coming together for high impact moments and experiences is going to be extremely salient in the years to come. And in fact, I think the notion of digital higher education is going to disappear. I think that the ultimate idea, it's like saying that we're having an electric higher education experience right now because the lights are on in here. It's great. You notice it when they're not on, but it doesn't mean that that's defining our experience. And I think that, the concerns of education that we kind of brought forward tonight are universal and are somewhat eternal, and the solutions are going to be ever-changing, and that's a good thing.
Thank you, Anya. Andrew.
Two possibly unrelated, disconnected, very quick comments. One is that, I think the term didn't come up in our discussion, but everybody's speaking these days about the flipped classroom. That is the idea that the delivery of content or the transmission of information, which was once something that was possessed by the academy, is now available in so many new ways and through so many new procedures, that should and could and will happen outside the classroom, and that something deeper and better and more complex will happen inside, that there will still be classrooms, and that something good of the sort that Angus is talking about might happen inside the classroom. I would only raise one question about that, and that is, I think we want to make sure that there's still somebody standing at the front of that classroom. That is, that the faculty in some shape or form will continue to exist. And David has already alluded to the fact that 2/3 of the faculty today are on very shaky ground. The second comment I want to make, and I'm not quite sure what conclusion to be drawn from this, but I just feel like making it. Anya alluded earlier quite appropriately to the shocking size of the population in this country that spends its youth in prison rather than in school or in college. It's my impression, and it's indirect, but it's pretty closely indirect because my daughter is teaching a course right now at San Quentin Prison where she's teaching Henry James to non-parolees. It's my impression that actually something very close to the old canonical classics-based education is happening here and there in our prisons, and that mostly men, mostly young men of color, who have no concern about what they're going to do after prison because there may be no after prison, are actually the most grateful recipients of the kind of education that a couple of us have been talking about up here. That's something worth thinking about.
Thank you, Andrew. David.
So I'm struck by two things in the kind of flow of our conversation where I've been a partisan, and I want to step back from my own positions and note them. One is that we have been talking about what's the value of understanding the past, and I think have different models of it. Although I was being the critiquer of heritage, I'm a historian by training. What I do is to study the past, and I think there's an interesting debate that's implicit in what we've said between as the answer to the question, what is the value of the past, especially in a moment of radical change, where we're entering into some radically new future, which all of us, I think, are saying either with worry or ambivalence or whatever. I think one model is it's to preserve legacy and heritage and protect it moving into the future. Jean gave one, and other folks gave one example of that. I would say the alternative way of understanding the value of the past that I would say is that it teaches us what it means to be living in history, which is to say, to inherit a past not of our making and to make it into a different future. So to me, that's the value of the past, and I'm actually not loyal to a heritage. I am loyal to understanding how we are historical beings. So that's thought one. And thought two is something that was brought up earlier that I think is really worth thinking about, which is we're living in a world where, as Anya said, we have access in our pockets to certainly the raw information for possibilities of language of knowledge that drown us. And I would say there's an interesting difference that we need to unpack between saying, in that situation of being potentially drowned, we need a canon to help us make distinctions, versus saying we need crap detectors. A canon points us to the things we need to know. Crap detectors give us guides for wading out into this chaos and navigating it. And I think one of the things we've been debating is the difference between those two responses to our situation.
Thank you, David. And Angus?
I think there's some kind of lovely consensus breaking out on the panel, which is not entirely against the spirit I'm trying to get to, which is we should be pretty judgmental and disagree with each other. But maybe that's the beauty of where difference is pulled together in one, is that we're being a model of the university up on the panel. Andy's example of the prison is great. It shows what happens when you start to think about being an end in yourself and not worrying about the means. And that's what we should look to in education is, what can it tell us about the sense in the meaning of being human is found in being an end in oneself and not a means to something else. It's not just in prisons you can find sources for optimism. There are lots of people on, MBA courses, business accountancy, economics courses who do get up every once in a while and say, hey, there's something more to life than this. And they say, would you come and teach us about the great books? And they don't spurn them or sneer at them, as sometimes happens in humanities departments. So I maybe sound a bit pessimistic about some things at an intellectual level at the state of the academy, but at the level of will, to paraphrase somebody, I'm actually quite optimistic, because the Western culture that we have to pass on, this legacy, is something maybe uniquely rooted in the valuing the freedom of the human subject as an end in himself. And that freedom is the thing where I think we just have to find ways to experiment with educational sites that have the greatest freedom for us to be involved in the process of becoming authoritative, which means sometimes to begin again, to notice that sometimes institutions do pass their sell-by date, and the walls are still standing and it still says Columbia University outside, but it's not necessarily a good signpost to what's going on inside. And that's not to say tear it down or set fire to it, or even that it's going to necessarily burn down. But there's always got to be room for some experiments in freedom and allowing the greatest possible autonomy for people to pursue the truth away from the dictates of orthodoxy. And finally, just to finish on a provocative note, I think the due seriousness we should afford education, we might see some of that in religious institutions, actually. Not to say that we should reintroduce faith into the academy literally, but just to take that as a kind of a model for due seriousness and to recognize that preserving and transmitting Western culture has been historically the best substitute we have for the shared meaning that's found in the rituals of religion, and to take very seriously the requirement that we guard and tend to that culture as best we can.
I'd like to invite you to thank our panelists for this evening. As is normally the case, we raise far more questions than we can ever handle or deal with in an actual salon or a satellite event. But I would encourage you to continue the discussion with us afterwards, to come to other salons. We have a series that we're doing with a new school. I think it was Eckhart Tolle who said that the past has no power over the present moment. Eckhart Tolle is very popular right now, and presentism seems to be something that does afflict much of society, perhaps not if it's in this room where people are very interested in history. We try and explore and examine some of these ideas moving forward, so please stay. We're going to go for a drink if you'd like to join us at Bar 6 restaurant, but we do need to move out of here fairly fast to help the students who have been suffering from Sandy, so thanks very much.
Yes, our students who are displaced are sleeping in this room if they need to.
Thank you, Nigel.
Very good, thank you.